Joining us to discuss this tonight is Erin Carr, Assistant Professor of Law at Seattle University. Erin, thanks for being with us tonight.
Good evening, Joyce.
So the Senate's expected to debate this SAVE Act through the week, and what exactly differentiates this bill from previous versions?
The SAVE Act was first proposed last year, but failed in the Senate. But earlier this year, Republican lawmakers reintroduced the SAVE Act. Both versions of the legislation have been justified by supporters as necessary to combat voter fraud by non-citizens, even though federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections with very strict penalties. And the government's own data shows that non-citizen voting is virtually non-existent. So what requirements does the SAVE Act impose, and how does it differ from the law that was proposed last year? Well, similar to the previous bill, the current version of the SAVE Act implements a national voter ID requirement that is more burdensome than almost every single state voter ID law in the nation, and would require American citizens to prove their citizenship status in order to vote using a passport or a birth certificate. What distinguishes the version of the SAVE Act that is presently being considered from the earlier iteration of the bill is that it wouldn't simply impose strict voter ID requirements. It would also require states to provide their voter rolls to the federal government.
And that in and of itself would be a huge change in how this process works across the country. So how does this proposal then interact with existing federal voting laws?
Yeah, I mean, as you alluded to, the SAVE Act, if it were passed, would transform voting laws and preempt many state laws. It would change how people vote and register to vote in many states. And it would impose barriers to voting by requiring citizens to provide documentation that many simply don't have. By some estimates, more than 21 million Americans lack the documents required to register to vote or to update their voter registration information under the SAVE Act. Only about half of Americans have a passport, and getting one is costly, particularly at a time of rising inflation. Voters who have changed their names, including transgender voters and an estimated 69 million American women who have adopted a married name, would encounter difficulties if they were to try to rely on a birth certificate to establish voter eligibility. And so millions of low-income voters, voters of color, rural voters, younger voters, women and non-binary voters, and naturalized citizens would all likely have difficulty providing the required documents because of financial limitations, misaligned records, and other obstacles.
It'd be interesting to see how many people in this moment could go and get their birth certificate and show it to you. So let's talk about requiring this proof of citizenship. Would it face constitutional challenges, and is there a path that would bring it to the Supreme Court if it passed?
The bill would most certainly be challenged as unconstitutional and violating federal law. The SAVE Act potentially infringes on the fundamental right to vote by imposing difficult, costly requirements for voting. Kansas, in fact, passed a similar documentary proof of citizenship law that resulted in tens of thousands of eligible voters being disenfranchised in that state. And that law was subsequently struck down as unconstitutional and in violation of the National Voter Registration Act. So if the SAVE Act were passed, there's every reason to expect that millions of voters would also be disenfranchised, and the law would face similar legal challenges.
And what would be the ripple effect on immigration policy and enforcement?
One of the many concerns involving the SAVE Act is that it would mandate that states hand over confidential voter information to the Department of Homeland Security. Since last year, the federal government has been pressuring states to provide their unredacted voter rolls. Dozens of states, including Washington, have refused to do so, citing concerns about misuse of the data, including use of this information by the Administration for Immigration Enforcement. But up until now, the Trump administration has had limited success in their efforts to access this sensitive voter data. But the SAVE Act could change that by legally requiring states to give up this information to the government.
This will be debated through the weekend. We'll absolutely be talking with you about this next week. Erin Carr from Seattle University, thank you so much.